Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Before we begin the next unit, are there any questions? I felt like last week I went a little bit too fast, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow it down a little bit, perhaps go into more detail about particular issues, and I'll do a hard stop at around 7:30, 7:35 to give 10-15 minutes for Q&A. And then whoever needs to make wudu can also utilize that time. All right, so no questions?
In the last week you mentioned that the beginning of political Islam was with Umar radiallahu anhu and then Muawiyah. But the current environment would end, and this separation of political Islam and Islam. It's like the separation of church and the state. So it looked at that they want to combine the state and the church in the term political Islam.
Right, so what I meant by political Islam was Islamic governance.
Okay.
Right, so Abu Bakr radiallahu anh being the Khalifa for 2 years and dealing with the apostates, he didn't have time to build a government. So Umar radiallahu anh did that. He did a lot of that. Him, Muawiyah, and Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. What I meant by that is they built the government system, or a type of system to govern the Muslim world. Right, so that's what I meant by it. As for the separation of church and state, I'll talk a little bit about that today, inshallah, if I get to there, but perhaps today. Yes. All right. With that, last week we concluded with the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate, and today we're going to start with the Abbasid Caliphate. And we will start just a little bit before the start of the Umayyad, the Abbasid Caliphate, because we need to understand what happened, how they overthrew the Umayyads. So the revolt against the Umayyads starts from the eastern part of the Muslim world, what we'd call today Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. Back then it was called Khurasan, that area. That's where the anti-Umayyad protest began. And if you remember from last week, there was a lot of anti-Umayyad sentiment because of their Arabism, Arab supremacy. So what happens is in the east, they use that against them. And we also mentioned there were natural, economical reasons. For example, Iraq, the water supply in Iraq increased, making it a more economically stable land in comparison to Syria. So that's what was going on. The anti-Abbasid revolts succeeds because of the grievances of Khurasan, Persia, etc. It was led by an individual called Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. Now, he wasn't necessarily part of the Abbasid group, if you will, but what happens is the Abbasids see in him someone who can do it. So he gives his loyalty to the Abbasids and says, I will do this for you, I'll carry it out. Some reports say Abu Muslim al-Khurasani wasn't even Muslim. There's some doubt in his religion, but I can't really verify that. It seems like his agenda was greater than an anti-Umayyad agenda. His agenda was more, I'm going to take this chance to cause some damage in general. But again, I can't verify such narrations, but they are out there. There are a lot of concerns about who this person is. And he killed a lot of Muslims, unjustly. So he was a violent person. The Umayyads exploit the pro-Adid sentiments, as well as their other widespread grievances. Right? So they exploit this culture of the eastern part of the Muslim world that was pro-Adid. Ali, etc. They use that against them. They use that to gain support, cultural support, and the support from the population, and they use that against the Umayyads. And I should point out here the following, right? Just to keep our minds, always on point and to see the picture more than what an average person might see it. Whenever someone who has political tendencies starts to chant cultural chants, right? Put a question mark right there. Put a question mark, right? So we see how when people try and analyze how Trump became the president, a lot of research points to the fact, or suggestions point to the fact that he just utilized a lot of stress that's present and valid stresses in the American population, right? Now, who's to say that someone on the left end of the ideological spectrum can't do the same thing with freedoms and diversity and unity and all that stuff? And what's his name? Noam Chomsky pointed that out in 2006. He said America is very lucky that some charismatic guy didn't come and take over politics. And then when Trump came, he's like, look, he's been telling us that for the past 13 years or 10 years at that time. So just always be aware and be sure that you understand someone who is politically motivated and uses cultural slogans. They're not necessarily sincere at that. Okay, just put a question mark there. Now, it doesn't mean that every single person is like that. Every single person is insincere, but always, double check and take it with a grain of salt. The Khurasani army defeats the Umayyad army and massacres the Umayyad family. I'm guessing this is the ruling Umayyad family, because if you remember last week, we said that Muawiyah radiallahu anh didn't really use much of his family. He wasn't like Uthman, who put his family members, his cousins, all over the place. Muawiyah actually stayed away from that. So a lot of the Umayyads were in Medina, or living in Medina as regular citizens. So it seems like perhaps what's meant by this is that they assassinated all heads of state. And that's very standard when a new political entity takes over. They assassinate all heads of state, right? There's only one Umayyad individual who survives, Abdurrahman II, I believe, and he goes to Spain. And he makes it into a Umayyad emirate. And I remember I mentioned last week that with the fall of the Umayyads, that marked the end of political, or I should say government unity in the Muslim world. Ever since the fall of the Umayyads, the Muslim Ummah have never been entirely under one government. Until this day today. Right? Somewhere we'll get into this a little bit later. The building of Baghdad, the center of the world. So when researchers historians look at the Umayyad or the Abbasid Caliphate, they split it into two categories: the High Abbasid and the Low Abbasid. The High Abbasid is referring to the high time of the Abbasid, their strength, and that lasts for about 2 centuries or a century and a half. And then after that, the Abbasids really fall in power, and we'll talk more about that once we get there. During this time, it becomes the golden age of Islam. So when you hear the golden era of Islam, it's during this time. And here are some of the reasons why it became the golden era. Baghdad becomes the capital. So during the Umayyad time, Syria, Damascus was the capital. Now that capital is moving to Baghdad. The House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, is established. Islamic law and theory and theology develop a lot. Religious mainstream, or what would be called popular religion, becomes more crystallized, more documented. There's a lot of translations that is going on from other cultures, like Greek and Hellenistic thought, Aristotelian thought. Science, literature, and culture really become widespread. And I'll get into these details momentarily. So the High Abbasid Caliphs, they begin with Abu al-Abbas. He is the first one of the Umayyads, followed by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, and Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid has 2 children, and we'll talk about their dispute in a moment. So, really there's a lot going on here, and what I want to do is try and take it category by category, so I'm not jumping back and forth, going all over the place. So I'll probably go through about 200 years of history just talking about governance and society. What was the Abbasid administration like? What were they doing? Also, what was Muslim society like? I mean, I've always been curious, well, how were the Muslims living back then? What kind of a society? How were they? Were they like us today in America, where you have all access to so much worldly goods? Or was it something else? How was it? And we'll get into that, inshallah. So let's start with the Abbasid governance. There were some new things introduced, changed by the Abbasid. The Umayyads were very much into expanding the Muslim lands. Right? They had a lot of fronts going on, whether it's east towards into Khorasan, they got to the border of China, or west, they got all the way to France. Right? They took Andalusia. Also to the north, they took parts of Constantinople, but not the city itself. The Abbasids changed that. They say we're not going to focus on expanding, rather we're going to focus on us, the interior affairs of the Muslim Ummah. And that's why they had such a golden era. The focus wasn't on the military. The government wasn't spending large sums of money on the army. Rather, it starts going into building the infrastructure, education, services for society in general. And this is something you see today. Countries that are involved in a lot of foreign policy, they put a lot of money into the military, and then there's a lot of inconveniences in society itself. So America has a lot of money, a huge budget that goes to the military, and that affects, insurance policy, education, medicine, pharmacy. Right? Whereas a country like Canada that doesn't really have much of a foreign policy or much of a foreign presence, they focus more on their internal structure. They say education there is free, medicine is free, going to the doctor is free. All these commodities, Sweden's like that, Finland, etc. So you have a huge area now, and what you find is that when it comes to the control that the Abbasids are enforcing on particular areas, it differs from place to place. Khurasan was very volatile. So they installed governments there, but they didn't really interfere much with what was going on over there. When it comes to the Arab world, including Iraq, Syria, Egypt, they had a stronger grasp over it, especially the cities. The cities were very much controlled, but once you get into the rural areas, it's not as much controlled. Something similar to what we see today here in America. The rural areas, the law isn't as enforced, or it's not as strongly present than in the cities, and that's for obvious reasons. Now, within within Muslim society, the Alids, the pro-Alids, right? Still, they're not called Shia as we call them today. The pro-Alids were very much upset with the Abbasids. Why? Because they exploited their grievances in order to gain political power. After that, they kind of just threw them up to the side. In fact, those who challenged the Abbasids were put down, as it's described here. They're put down. Or others who cooperated were honored. They're given pensions. They were guests in the capital, etc. Also, something else that the Abbasids do that the Umayyads didn't do was they tried and really cater to the scholars. And by cater, I mean they were trying to silence them by honoring them. Okay, and we'll see how that doesn't really work for them. At this point, they start appointing judges, right, qadis. Before that, in the Umayyads, there was no such thing as a qadi, and I'll get to that also in a moment. But overall, in general, there's a lot of continuity with the Marwanid style of administration. They didn't change much. And last week, one of the audience members asked a question, and it's really a question that bothers us. If there's all this feud and all this political turmoil that's going on in the Muslim world, why should we expect anything different? This whole idea, this notion where we can unify the Muslims once again, what's the point? It never worked before. However, I'd say that although there was a lot of political turmoil, society in general was not really affected by it. So it wasn't a complete upheaval of the state. In fact, it was simply a continuity with the prior state. And in fact, the Muslims perfect this style of switching administrations, as we'll talk about once we get to the Mongol era, the Seljuks and whatnot, which is a little bit down the line. Some more information about the Abbasid administration. So this is a new style of PowerPoint. If the letters are small, I apologize. Just let me know after. But it looks a lot nicer. It looks a lot cooler. So the Abbasids were very effective in suppressing Arab supremacy. Right? So they continued Umar ibn Abdul Aziz's strategies in making sure that Arabs don't become supreme, right? Arabism and whatnot. That Islam and the government is inclusive and not exclusive. So when it comes to military, they made it into a profession. Now someone who's a soldier is paid by the government. Back in the day, what they would do is call to jihad and people would go and volunteer. That's what the military was. It was very successful, but it wasn't organized. So now that the Abbasids are trying to organize the government, part of what they do is they organize the army as well. It now becomes a branch of government, a department of government. They reduce the size of the army only to defend the frontiers of the dynasty. Remember, they're not trying to expand, they're trying to just do with what they have. Government is further bureaucratized. Continuing the Marwanid pattern, there are three types of bureaus, diwans that they're called. You have the Rasail, and you have the taxation, and the army. Okay, so now you have departments of government actually being official and part of the system of government and system of administration. Islamic law appointment of qadis. So now they developed a Supreme Court, what we call today a Supreme Court. There are qadis. So someone like Abu Yusuf, the disciple of Abu Hanifa, was a qadi under the Abbasid dynasty administration. Muftis are becoming more, and remember, back in the time of the Umayyads, there was no such thing as a alim class. Right? There weren't ulama. Who are the ulama? They were just intellectuals. And a lot of times, the khulafa were also ulama of the religion, as we consider or classify today. You had the development of viziers or wazirs, ministers. A wazir in the Arabic language literally means someone who lightens or carries the burden. So the point of a wazir, is what we call today a minister. He takes part of the responsibilities of the president or the highest political authority. The viziers were assistants to the caliphates, but what happens a lot of times in the Abbasid dynasty is that these viziers become extremely powerful to the extent that they can overthrow the Khalifa, right? So whoever watches Erdogan, they saw how that kind of played out. The province were ruled flexibly with more or less bureaucratic control. So I mentioned this. Governors were rapidly rotated. So one of the strategies in the high Abbasid time is that in order to make sure that these political officials did not gain too much power, they would rotate them every, what we call today terms. So when America has terms, well, there's a reason why. You can't be in government too long, or else you're going to gain too much loyalty from other people, and then it becomes a threat to the government. So Umar radiallahu anh was the first person to do this. Every now and then he would change governors. Why? So that they don't gain too much loyalty. And back in the day, what would happen is you have a governor, for example, he has his own army. He has his, today in a state, for example, the state has its Supreme Court, and it has its assembly, and it has representatives. A state technically is built as a country, but it is loyal to the government, right? So these viziers and these governors had the same exact thing. Well, if his army becomes too strong, he can literally use it against the Khalifa himself. Taxation and judiciary were separated from the office to minimize corruption. So what we call today the different branches of government. They're separated so that one individual doesn't have too much power. So when it comes to issues of financing and taxation, that was its own separate department that the Khalifa did not have access to. Or if he wanted access to it, he needed approval from the designated, those in position. And then the same thing with the law. The Supreme Court is independent. Just like today in America, a judge can block something the president does, as we saw with the whole fiasco in the ban on Muslims. And this created a healthy, balance of power. They kept each other in check, right? Also, they utilized the barid. So last time we mentioned the barid, the Umayyads developed this system called barid, which was meant to send messages, what we call today the postal system, the postal services. What the Abbasids do is that they actually use this to serve as like a secret service, right? So what we call today the CIA, FBI, this was through the barid, the postal service. Harun al-Rashid, what he does is he shrinks the size of these provinces. So during the Umayyads, there were literally 4 provinces. You have the east, from Iraq all the way to Khurasan, this area, right? Because remember, these borders are the same as the borders of the Umayyads. So you'd have from this right here, you can see the pointer, from here all the way east, right? That was to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Right? And then you had the Arabian Peninsula. And then you had Syria, and then the west. So 4 provinces. One person was in control of all of this. Of course, he had his governors and his mayors and whatnot, but one person was in control of all of that. What Harun al-Rashid does, he shrinks the sizes. And I counted them, I think there were 31 states right here, 31. But it's not including the western part of the Muslim world. I guess that's because the Umayyads had control of that, or at least Spain. So Harun al-Rashid does this to minimize influence. So he actually falls into a problem with one of his wazirs. One of his wazirs became too powerful. And he realized it's either him or me. And he had to do something about that. So when we look at Baghdad, this is a rendering, an illustration of the Khalifa's headquarters. I mean, this is amazing. This is amazing. It's 2 kilometers in diameter, and I calculated, so it's 6.2 kilometers squared in terms of area. So to give a little bit of an idea of how big that is, if you think of the Prophet's Mosque is about 4 kilometers squared. So this is bigger than present day Prophet's Masjid. This is just the quarters of the Khalifa. Why is it a circle? Because the circle was considered by the Greeks to be like the best shape, right? What is that?
That includes everybody?
No, this doesn't include. This is just the political headquarters.
No, I meant the shape. No. The circle includes everybody. That's why they favored it, perhaps.
What does it mean by
Like
includes everybody? Look at that.
It's all good.
All right, so this is the headquarters. It housed about 500,000 people in 25 squared. So this is Baghdad. I'll show you a picture of Baghdad. It was a cosmopolitan area and very multi-religious and multi-ethnic. This is another rendering where this is what you just saw, the political headquarters, and these are the suburbs. This is how it was. And you see they have bridges, right? They have ports. This is the Tigris River. The Euphrates is not too far from this. It doesn't appear here. So it looks like there's a wall here, and that's how cities were. They was protected by a wall. So the grand failure of the Umayyads, of the Abbasids. The Umayyads was the Arab supremacy, right? For the Abbasids, it's the problem of succession. They have a lot of problem when it comes to those who succeed the current Khalifa or the previous Khalifa. The Abbasids had great success, but one great failure that haunted them more than even the Umayyads was succession of power. Having adopted the absolute monarchical model of the pre-Islamic empires, the Abbasids had to reconcile with the following, right? So they were more monarchical than the Umayyads. The Umayyads used the Arab, style, right? The Arab style where we choose, sure, it might be someone from the tribe, but it's the best fit person from the tribe. It wasn't the son of the current leader, right? So the Arabs really didn't like that. This isn't something that we are accustomed to, right? And when it came to the religious group, they're saying that this is not in line with Islamic law. This is very problematic, and they're very critical of that. Islam promotes shura, right? It promotes public participation, or the participation of a type of a style of electing individuals, a style of basing laws based on a group of people, a collective effort, rather than an individual choice. Right? So that caused a lot of problem with popular society. The emergence of Sunni thought, which we'll talk about in a moment, of the period, otherwise increasingly it is increasingly in its mass appeal and independence, offers no solid answer to the question of succession. Right? So what happens is the scholars don't really have an answer to how exactly does a Khalifa succeed a Khalifa. Remember, we spoke about that in the second session when we spoke about how the four Khulafa, the first four, were designated or appointed. It was very different. So there was nothing clear-cut when it comes to this regard. What you have during this time are people like Mawardi and others who talk about this, right? What's called the Siyasa al-Shar'iyya, or Mawardi called Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, the laws regarding the Sultan, or the highest political authority. So they try and reconcile between that. And this is also a focal point of this session. I'll talk more about that once we get to Ibn Taymiyyah in a few sessions down. When it comes to social life, it's recorded that during the High Abbasid time, was one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, government ever. Now, I don't know if that includes modern times today, like America, but for sure, pre-America, the Abbasid dynasty was the wealthiest dynasty in recorded history, right? And also, the average income is recorded as being the highest ever. Lucky them, right? And again, I don't know if that includes current times right now, because there's a book called Debt, 5,000 Years of Human History, and it talks about, it's a book of economics, and talks about the economic situation of the various dynasties over 5,000 years. In terms of their homes had high ceilings for ventilation and cooling, but there was no recorded system of heating, a formal system of heating aside from firewood. Homes didn't contain much furniture because Muslims prefer to sit on the floor or to be closer to ground level and sleep at ground level than having these furnitures. And it's pretty common still in the Middle East today, right? Especially when you get into the outskirts of the Muslim world. They like to sit on the floor. They don't really like the whole couches and sleeping on beds and whatnot. At this time, education was becoming more available, accessible, and formal. You have an individual called Fatima al-Fihri, who was in the 9th century of Common Era, Morocco, in a city called Fez. She establishes what some consider to be the first university ever, Al-Qarawiyyin. Others consider it to be the oldest remaining university. Here's a picture of it. In fact, research shows that women played a major role in making education more accessible to orphans and to others. So this exists till today. And subhanAllah, people are still learning from it, and she gets the reward of all of that. During this time, there's a general thirst for knowledge. Knowledge is very important. It's part of the fabric of society, and people were concerned with their level of knowledge. And this would continue throughout the Abbasid era, up until the Mongol era. So for about 400, 500 years, Muslims were very much involved in research and learning and science. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. There were interfaith debates, discussions, and dialogue. This was very common. And I'll explain more about that in just a moment. For example, the question, is the Quran a created object? This created a big problem, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. That was actually posed by a Christian. This whole fiasco that would happen was initiated because a Christian asked a question. Right? So this whole notion where if you say anything about Islam, Muslims are going to chop your head off. That just wasn't the case. People would talk, Jews and Christians would question Islam, they would criticize Muslims and certain positions of Muslims, and at the same time they would dialogue with one another. A lot of Islamic law and theology was established because of questions asked by non-Muslims. Rationality, reason, becomes the language of scholarship and intellectuals. And that's important because there have always been this tension between reason and revelation. Right? Are we supposed to be logical in understanding the Quran even if it seems to go against the apparent meaning of the verses or not? Well, this initiated not as a movement of understanding the Quran, but rather a language through which they communicate with the greater society. So here in America, if a person wants to be an intellectual, a Muslim in America wants to be an intellectual, they have to go through academia. There's a type of language, there's a type of style of presenting information. Right? So they have to adopt that language in order to be more effective in portraying Islam and relaying Islam as well. This is very interesting. This is taken from Richard Bullitt, who is I believe French researcher in Middle Eastern studies. He writes some really interesting books, part of which is understanding the conversions to Islam. Right? This question, how did these societies that were predominantly non-Muslim, in fact 100% non-Muslim, how did they enter into Islam? So the Islamophobe, Fox News, right-wing opinion or statement is that Islam spread by the sword. Right? We've all heard of this. However, this research suggests something different. Now at the bottom here you have the year. These are years. Right? And on the left here you have at the y-axis, this is the percentage of Muslims in the population. So if we were to say minority groups in Islam, that would actually be an invalid way of describing the situation because up until about the 3rd century of Islam, Muslims were a minority in Muslim lands. There were more Christians, Jews, whatever faith than Muslims. And why is this so significant is because look, the emergence of Malikis and Hanafis. Look at how many, 20% of the population was Muslim, that's it. And Malikis and Hanafis embody the crux of Islamic law. In other words, Islamic law was being developed in a time where Muslims were a minority. It's nothing new for Muslims to be a minority. And they succeeded immensely. Now another question we can pose, well, did they consider non-Muslim realities in their fiqh? Imam Malik was living in Medina, maybe not so much, but Abu Hanifa, of course. And you see how that affects their fatwas, how that affects their opinions. Not to say that they are being skewed, but rather it gives a different angle to which they approach these texts. So during this time, there's a lot of political turmoil. So that rules out any question, well, did politics have something to do with that? In fact, sometimes this time frame, the economy wasn't doing so well. So how do we explain this? Well, you see that they entered Islam slowly. If they were forced into Islam, the chart would be like this. Right? They all enter at once, but it's a steady growth. Now the theory is that by this time over here, when it's increasing, Muslims and non-Muslims are now speaking the same language. So this is Iran. This is a study from Iran. There's another one for Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. Right? This one's for Iran. What the theory is saying is that, well, people in Iran weren't speaking Arabic. But by this time, Arabic becomes the universal language, the language of the society, and now they're able to engage with one another. So it's an intellectual entrance into Islam and not a political or a forced entry into Islam. Now this topic gets very juicy. Islamic scholarship. During this time, as I mentioned, still the ulama, this class of ulama didn't exist in the beginning of the Abbasid era. During the Umayyad period, right, there was no such thing as a mufti, a qadi, or a sheikh, as we call them today. Umar II, if you remember, he gave a lot of attention to scholars or to people learned in Islam. He gave them a lot of influence and a lot of power. Right? Disapproval of politicians and their behaviors caused scholars to become more critical of the government. So when we enter this era, the Abbasids, right, Abu Hanifa and Malik, they witnessed, or Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik both witnessed the fall of the Umayyads, and they did engage the Umayyads, right? So it's said that they participated in revolts against the Umayyads. They didn't participate physically, they participated intellectually. So they were promoting it, they were encouraging it, right? Why? Because the Hanafis and the Malikis, at this time, they still considered the Khalifa to be part of the system of Islamic law, right? And because they viewed the Khulafa as being illegitimately elected or illegitimately appointed to their positions, they saw them as invalid. And therefore, they needed to uplift that and put a valid Khalifa because that was something crucial to their fiqh, right? Now, Imam al-Shafi'i, when he comes, he says, okay, this isn't working. The strategy of Abu Hanifa and Malik aren't working. All the revolts are failing, and it's leading us nowhere. Imam al-Shafi'i, what he does is start separating the two realms. And I'll show a picture later on. He starts separating the two realms, right? In other words, he's doing this. You see this line right here, right? Just imagine this. You see this line? On the right, this is scholarship. You stay in your area, we stay in ours. You dare cross over into ours, you're going to get it, right? So essentially, scholarship, Islamic law, is monopolized by Muslim scholars. No one enters this realm, it is our realm. Politicians have nothing to say there. And this becomes very important, and I'll go more into that once I get to the chart. So Imam al-Shafi'i starts doing that. And then during the time of Imam Ahmad, this becomes crystallized. Here's a chart. Oh man, this map it's not clear. So here's a chart of the Muslim world. And the ones in this orangish color, this orange-yellow color, these are the four imams of fiqh. The ones in the red color are the imams of hadith. Look at the diversity. Now, if the picture was clear, you can see the map. So Bukhari is from Uzbekistan, like the northern part of Uzbekistan, or the central part of Uzbekistan. Tirmidhi is from the southern part, close to Iran and these other areas. Muslims from Iran. Abu Dawood is from Afghanistan. Abu Hanifa is from Kufa. Imam Ahmad is from Baghdad. Shafi'i is from Gaza. Imam Malik is from Medina. Ibn Majah is from Iran, right? And then I guess this is Nasa'i. It's from Turkmenistan. Diversity. There's diversity in scholarship. What makes this even more beautiful is the following. This isn't clear either. The bold names are the imams, and the blue names are the imams of hadith. Now, this is a tree of Islamic scholarship. This is showing who the teachers of each of these scholars were. So Abu Hanifa, his fiqh goes back to Kufa, and his fiqh, the fiqh of Kufa, goes back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So Abu Hanifa is the embodiment of the fiqh of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Imam Malik, being in Medina, his fiqh goes back to Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas. He is the embodiment of Ibn Umar ibn Abbas. And that shows you that the fiqh that we have today is essentially the fiqh of the companions. And the fiqh of the companions is based on what they observed from the Prophet ﷺ and what they know from the Quran. Imam al-Shafi'i then comes. Now, there was tension between Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, the schools. The tension was intellectual, right? It wasn't personal, it was intellectual. Imam Malik is what they call from the school of al-Athar. He is about, this is what the Quran says, this is what Hadith says, and therefore this is the law. Abu Hanifa didn't have as much access to Hadith. It didn't reach that area at this time. So the Imams of the Hadith are down here. They come about a century and a half after Abu Hanifa. Now, of course, the Hanafis would eventually adapt and incorporate this to their system of law. But during the time of Abu Hanifa, he didn't have as much access to Hadith. So he had to rely on what's called ra'i, logic, reason. We need to look at the Quran. We have most access to that. We need to try and understand what the Quran is getting at and build a system. Right? We need to look at the Quran. What are the principles of the Quran? Therefore, we can build off those principles instead of having to find a particular text that talk about a particular issue. So there was tension here. They don't like each other's approach. Now, Imam al-Shafi'i then comes. So Imam al-Shafi'i is a student of Imam Malik. Right? Here's Imam Malik, here's Shafi'i, and he's also a student of Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, who is a student of Abu Hanifa. He learns from both. So now he's taking from the school of the Atharis and the school of the Ra'i. And what he does is he marries them to one another. He synergizes them. And he comes up with the first book of Usul, called Al-Um. And he is reconciling between the two. He said, you know what? We can actually use both. We can make both work together. So Imam al-Shafi'i, his school is technically a hybrid of the previous two schools. And then his student, Imam Ahmad, is a continuation of that. And Imam Ahmad is also a student of Abu Yusuf. Right? Yes. So that's how fiqh comes about. That's what it is. How do we understand Quran? How do we understand Hadith? They have their epistemologies. Imam Shafi'i marries the two, brings them together, and from him we get a very important concept, and that is the concept of jama'ah. And I'll talk about that, inshallah, towards the end if we have time for that. So I mentioned Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Ra'i, what happened there. So Shafi'i is now changing the political model. He is forcing this to change, saying that, you know what, we need to separate ourselves, the scholars, cannot be influenced by politicians, nor should politicians have the ability to legislate religious law. You got to separate the two realms. Here's another image. So you have Abu Hanifa and Malik, and they go to Imam Shafi'i takes from both. Imam Shafi'i is here, and then Ahmad ibn Hanbal takes from Shafi'i and also Abu Yusuf. So just to elaborate a little bit more on the tension between the political branch of society and the religious, the Sunni ulama, right, when it comes to the marker of privilege, who is someone who is privileged, in Islam it's a profession of knowledge, possession of knowledge, right? Someone who's privileged, and I don't mean socially privileged to where they have more access to government, more access to goods, but rather when a person is viewed as someone who's noble, dignified, that's actually through knowledge, right? Well, the question is, well, who can attain knowledge? Anyone, everyone. Everyone has access to Islamic knowledge, right? So anyone can gain this. So it's a free market, if so to speak. Whereas when it comes to the politicians, it's about social rank and birth privilege. If you're born into the Abbasid, caliphate, well, you're lucky. Other than that, you're out of luck. When it comes to the vision, the end goal, where should we take society? The scholars, of course, are more about applying the justice of the religious law and rectitude, salvation, about the next life. The politicians, high culture. We got to make sure the income is higher. our technology is advanced, up to date, etc. The vision of society, scholars want it to be egalitarian, right? There's no such thing as symbolic religious authority, where if you're born into the Prophet ﷺ's bloodline, that you're somehow a religious authority. That's simply not the case. Rather, it's based on your character, your ability to apply and embody Quran and Sunnah. And then when it comes to the politicians of that time, it was a hierarchy. Right? So we spoke about Abu Hanifa, Malik, and Shafi'i. Of course, there's a lot of information there. However, I'm trying to focus on one particular point and how they engage politics and greater society. When it comes to Imam Ahmad, he plays a very important role in the development of Islamic society and Islamic, what would become Sunni Islam. And that is what's called the mihna, the tribulation. Right? Imam Ahmad goes through a mihna. Now, to give context to this, we need to take a step back. And that is during the time of Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid was one of the praised, probably the best Abbasid caliph, and one of the best khulafa of our history. It was during his time the wealth was immense. I mean, it said that he once looked at a cloud and said, "Rain wherever you want to, you're coming back to me." Meaning wherever it rains, the economic benefit of that rain is going back to his government. Right? Now Harun al-Rashid had two children, Amin and Ma'mun. He appoints Amin as his crown prince. Amin, his mother, he's the son of an Arab wife of Harun al-Rashid. Whereas Ma'mun, his other son, was a son of a Persian woman. Right? So Harun al-Rashid favored his Arab wife and appointed Amin. However, Ma'mun was far more capable, far more qualified, and that drew him mad. Right? And what happens is Ma'mun, he is in Khurasan, right? His brother Amin is in Baghdad. Ma'mun pretty much gathers the army and overthrows Amin and kills him. He later regrets that, but after the fact. Now, this is a disaster to the Muslims, and this causes a lot of problems. And remember, there are opponents already. The scholars are not happy with the political state, or the politicians, I should say. The Shia, by Shia, I mean those pro-Alid, right? Not necessarily who we call Shias today. But remember, the pro-Alids were very upset with the Abbasids. Why? Because they exploited them. So they were an opposition. And you had generally an anti-caliph sentiment. He overthrew and killed his brother. Right? Well, who does that? Right? These are Muslims. They were appalled by these actions. So Ma'mun has plenty of opposition. Now Ma'mun isn't a nobody. Right? He's not just some random guy who, what we're used to today, politicians are people who, know nothing. Right? They're the biggest losers and who have somehow made it to a high political rank. But when you ask them pressing questions and intellectual questions, they can't give you a proper sentence, right? And Ma'mun was a genius. A genius. He was a poet. He was a linguist. He was a muhaddith. There are hadith in which he is part of the chain. He is an astronomer. You see the display right over there in the corner, right? That is Ma'mun. It's said that, and let me just think of this. It said that he attempted to calculate the circumference of the earth using the stars. The circumference of the earth, he tried calculating it using stars. Right? He has poetry. He was a physician too. Right? I mean, who does that? If you're a physician, you're not just a physician in all branches of medicine. You specialize in something. That's all you can do. He was that and more. And it said that he would call the scholars and debate them and beat them in the debates. This is Ma'mun. So he's not a nobody. Look, here are some drawings of him. I don't know if this is actual handwriting. I tried reading it. It starts with Alhamdulillah, Mas'alatun min kitab, something. And this is the Kaaba. He's looking at the various positions or the north, south, east, west, etc. He minted the coin. It says La ilaha illallah, right? Muhammad Rasulullah. So he's not a nobody. But his challenge was he had a lot of public opposition. And he will try and overcome that. In other words, to put it differently, a political leader needs influence. And if he has a lot of opposition, he loses that influence. So what happens is the following. During this time, you have the rise of who would be called the Mu'tazilites. Right? This is a heterodox branch of Islam. And the story goes that someone named by the name of Wasil ibn Ata is sitting in the circle of Hassan al-Basri, and he disagrees with Hassan al-Basri and tells him something, and then Hassan al-Basri says, "I'tazalana," and he left us. So Mu'tazilites are those who kind of left or excluded themselves. Now the Mu'tazilites were using reason and rationality to speak about Islam. Remember, I mentioned that this started as a way of communicating with non-Muslims. When you're talking to a non-Muslim and they ask you a question, what is Islam's stance when it comes to monotheism, or why do you believe monotheism? We're not just going to tell them that the Quran says so. Right? That's not convincing to them. You can't use Quran to convince someone who doesn't believe in the Quran. You can't use it as evidence. Between each other we could, but to non-Muslims that's not an authority, it's not evidence. So they had to resort to arguments using reason and rationality to prove their points. Now that goes a little bit beyond that. It becomes more of, not abrogating, it becomes more of overriding apparent meanings of the Quran because it goes against a person's logic or reason, right? So what happens is the following. The Mu'tazilites have gained a lot of political influence and positions. And the Mu'tazilites tended to be from the Hanafis. So these aren't quack jobs. They're not people way out there talking like today what you find, right? It's any random person, some pseudo-sheikh who had absolutely no training in Islam is now talking about Islam and doing these things and making videos and his face is on posters and whatnot and flyers. It's not that. These were scholars. These were legitimate scholars, right? However, the common theory is that the Mu'tazilites influenced al-Ma'mun, particularly in an issue called Khalq al-Quran. Is the Quran created? And what happens, the story goes as follows. The Muslims when they debate Christians, they say you worship something that is, what was it? Oh, just give me one moment to remember the argument. Oh yes, so the argument was, they're saying that Jesus, you guys worship Jesus, right, who's created. Jesus is a created being, how can you worship him? They say no, Jesus is not created, he's a God, and whatnot. They said no, the argument goes, that's unacceptable. Logically, that doesn't make sense. They said no, it does make sense. You guys claim the Quran is from Allah, and that's something uncreated, and you follow it. Right? That's what they pose. So the Mu'tazilites, now this is a very new question, and it's a deep question. So the Mu'tazilites may have been a little bit quick in answering that, and they simply say that, no, the Quran is created, to get out of that. Right? And this creates a massive problem. Now the other scholars like Imam al-Shafi'i and Abu Ahmad, they say no, that's not the case, right? That's not the case. The Quran is uncreated because it is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't have time to get into all of the details. It's a very, very complex issue. But the Sunni scholars reject this notion. What happens is Ma'mun starts forcing them to convert to the Mu'tazilite position. Anyone who disagrees, they get tortured, right? So Ma'mun starts sending messengers to all of these scholars with a document saying that the Quran is a created book, a created entity. And they have to sign off on it. Anyone who doesn't sign off, they're imprisoned, they're tortured. Most scholars under the torture, just out of coercion, they sign, with the exception of Imam Ahmad. He doesn't do it, he stands against that. Now, new research suggests something else. It suggests that Ma'mun actually exploited them to gain influence. How so? Remember, Ma'mun is an intellectual. He's an intellectual, he knows the language of reason and rationality. Now, although he was a scholar of Islam, a learned individual of Islam, he was nothing in comparison to Imam Ahmad. It was nothing in comparison to these other scholars, Ishaq al-Rahawayh and these other guys. They were the giants. And they also had social influence. So in order to gain himself a lot more influence, he wanted to change the language of scholarship to rationality. Why? To beat the scholars. Sound similar? Sound similar to something today? Yeah? Does it sound similar? Influence. When an individual has 20 million followers on Facebook, and you have someone new coming who's young, well, that's a big threat. That is a big threat, right? So it seems like Ma'mun utilized them in order to put power into his hand and have more influence. But that backfires. So Imam Ahmad doesn't budge. He's the only one who doesn't budge. So Imam Ahmad was a nobody. Imam Ahmad, today we say Imam Ahmad radiyallahu anhu, Imam Ahmad was this, Imam Ahmad was that. During his time, Imam Ahmad was just some guy named Ahmad. Some guy who had ripped up clothes. He was a nobody, right? He didn't have any political positions. He had nothing. He was very poor too, right? Why did Ma'mun care so much about him? Because people loved him. People loved him. Scholars, right, had a lot of influence in society. They were people who helped others. They were people who stood and helped those in need. They promoted good. People loved that, right? So it wasn't that Imam Ahmad threatened him in any way. It's just that he had a lot of followers. So if he can force convert Ahmad, then he gets all of his followers as well. So initially the Hanabila, their position on this issue was, we don't say it's created, we don't say it's uncreated. Again, this is a very new issue. They didn't know how to deal with it, right? Like modernity. When we talk about modernity, scholars didn't know what to do. All of this is new, right? How do we reconcile? How do we deal with this? Later, his opinion would turn to say that the Quran is an uncreated document. So it's said that Ma'mun arrests Imam Ahmad and then tells them to bring him to his quarters. Imam Ahmad makes a dua. He says, Allahumma la tarini wajha. So, oh Allah, I want to see his face. And Ma'mun dies before he reaches the quarters. He is released. His two successors, Mu'tasim and Al-Wathiq, they continue this. They continue this persecution and this inquisition. Both of them died during the time of Imam Ahmad, I believe. Then Al-Mutawakkil adopts the position of Imam Ahmad. And this mihna is concluded. Why is this mihna so important? Because of its implications. What happens as a result of the mihna? First is the crystallization of Sunni doctrine. I mentioned during the time of the Umayyads, before this, there was no such thing as Sunni thought. You had proto-Sunnis, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa, and I forgot to mention this, Imam Abu Hanifa is quoted as saying, Iman is irrespective of actions. Now, the other scholars say actions are part of Iman, right? So this causes some confusion. Why would Imam Abu Hanifa say that? Imam Abu Hanifa, when you do the research, he's not saying that Iman doesn't increase or decrease. He's not saying actions don't affect the strength of a person's Iman. Rather, he is refuting the actions of the Umayyads, right, who was taxing non-Arabs even after they converted, right? They would say that, they're just saying that. Or their actions don't prove that they are Muslims, and their actions are against that. So Abu Hanifa is battling this and saying, if someone says, La ilaha illallah, if they say that they are a Muslim, then they are a Muslim regardless of whether they act upon it or not. Whether they practice or not is irrelevant to the fact that they are Muslims. So that's why he said it. You see how different that is. A lot of people, especially the young ones, when they enter these theological debates between these imams, it comes, he said this and that's a bid'ah, he said that. Well, why did he say that? We take it for granted the intelligence of these people. They're not talking out of nothing. Well, sometimes to fully appreciate what they are saying, you need to understand the context in which they are saying it. Another very important development because of this is that there's no longer, it shuts the door of any type of papacy. Papacy meaning there is no pope in Islam. There is no one individual who determines what Islam means for all of Muslims. That just doesn't happen, right? There isn't some guy who says, what this verse means is X, Y, Z, and we all have to follow it. It's binding upon all of us. No, that's not the case. Imam Ahmad, because of his stance, stops this. Or else if Ma'mun would have won, it could have become just that. Ma'mun would have become the religious authority as well, who says this and that, X, Y, Z, that's Islam, and it's binding upon everyone. So Imam Ahmad, because of the mihna, stops that. Also, as a result, the caliph is no longer seen as a religious authority, and he's not religiously He's not important to our understanding of religion, right? So if you remember the previous two sessions, I showed you that circle, and in it, the Khalifa was the highest political authority and highest religious authority, right? Imam Ahmad splits that, or Imam Shafi'i splits that, and then the Mihna seals it. Also, as a result, the Mu'tazilites fall. They lost a lot of influence. Why? Because they were on the wrong side. Imam Ahmad gained a lot of influence. In fact, it's said that because when he passed away, during his janazah, 20,000 non-Muslims accepted Islam. Christians and Jews loved Imam Ahmad. Why? Because he stood up to what they saw as injustice. Right? The Mu'tazilites were on the wrong side, and they lost a lot of influence. It's not like they lost an intellectual battle. They lost a social battle. That's what it was. And this is not to say they were insincere. I should make that a point. But they were just on the wrong side. Right? The ulama now become an official class of society. The ulama. Who are the ulama? Well, these are the scholars. And they gain a lot of influence and a lot of social power. Ulama are seen as representatives of the people of the people, and the greatest opposition to politicians and establishments. What is the role of a scholar? I mean, this is a big question today in our times because everything kind of collapsed with colonialism. And we'll talk more about that once we get there. But a scholar is a man or a person of the people. He is with the people. If you want to know a scholar who's truly a scholar, along with the knowledge, look at how people look up to that person. Now, I've seen people, scholars, who, when they walk from the masjid to their home, you have 30 people, not 30, like anyone who's outside knows them, he knows them, and they say salam to one another, how are you doing, etc. He has those relations. And I've seen people, right, who are sheikhs, and from the masjid to their home, no one even looks at them, right? The scholar plays a vital role in society. And these dynamics last until colonialism. And I'll tell you what happens, inshallah, once you get there. Also, as a result, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is born. Now, we've heard this term, and we focus on Sunnah a lot. What is the Sunnah? What is the Prophet? What is the orthodox position of this? That's important. What about Al-Jama'ah? What does that mean? We tend to not focus on this. And Imam Shafi'i is a good role model for that. What did Imam Shafi'i do? He took two intellectual giants, and he said, you know what? We can put these together and work together. The Jama'ah part of this idea is that we try our best to keep the Muslim Ummah, right, together. It is not my goal to refute someone and throw them out of Islam. It is my goal to try and incorporate that person if possible. And the Hanafis have a very beautiful fiqh ruling. That is, if someone says something concerning, it is an obligation, not recommended, not part of ethics. It's a fiqh obligation to hold that person's, what they said, in the lightest meaning, in the most, give them the benefit of the doubt. They say something problematic, well, what are the possibilities? And then we have to give them the benefit of the doubt as much as possible, right? So Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah board. So this is what I've been talking about. The ulama now are a separate realm from politics, from the politician, political establishment. Now there is something connecting them, and that is the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is essentially part of the ulama structure. But they just have a political position. The politicians have absolutely no influence on the laws which these two groups apply. Meaning the Khalifa can't come and say that in terms of, for example, in terms of divorce, this is the ruling. They have no authority over that. It is the scholars who say this is the ruling. And then the Khalifa just kind of executes that. He has no right to say that. The Khalifa's responsibility are in areas of government that are irreligious. What we call today, for example, the rules of the road, right? That's an irreligious matter. No one's going to say my religion is against, red lights, right? These are irreligious things, irrespective of a person's faith. So this is what happens. The ulama, you have our realm, right? This is us. You dare cross into it, we're going to chop you up. We're going to cut your hand and send you back. And this remains throughout until the era of colonialism and post-colonialism, and you see this most effective during the time of the Ottomans. The Supreme Court, the Muftis, the Hanafis were so powerful, right? I mentioned this, that they can give a fatwa to get the Khalifa executed. Balance of power, right? And we'll talk more about that, inshallah. One thing definitely to point out, and this is not but least, this is a very important topic, and that is alimat, female scholarship in Islam. A very hot topic, and you hear a lot of concerns. You know, if there was more participation from female scholars, you would see a different sharia. Right? You'd find a different sharia. Thank you, Muhammad.
Yeah.
Right? So you have these type of concerns. However, Akram al-Nadwi has a book called Al-Muhaddithat, and he summarizes a 14-volume book that is dedicated to finding female scholars in Islamic history. What he finds is the following. 1/4, 25% of Islamic law that is applied today, both in ibadat, right, in acts of worship and in legal issues, 1/4 goes back to female scholarship. Okay, well, why don't we find that? How's that true? Has anyone ever picked up a classical book of Islam that's authored by a female? We all know Ibn Taymiyyah, we all know Imam Nawawi, we all heard of Bukhari and Muslim, all these are men. Where are the female books, right? Why there aren't any female books, I don't know. However, this is talking about something different. This is talking about rooted law, not written or not books or research. This is law that is rooted in female scholarship. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Everyone here knows about the order of operations in math, right? You do power and square root first, then you do division, multiplication second, and then you do addition, subtraction last, right? We all know this. Who here can name the person who developed that? Does it make his role any less significant? That's influence. Literally math, all of math, and all of its branches, any sort of math equation goes back to this individual. This is what it means when 1/4 of Islamic law is rooted in that. For example, praying 4 rak'ahs before dhuhr is a hadith narrated by a female. That's what it means. How many people know that when they pray 4 rak'ahs before dhuhr, that it's a female who that goes back to? We don't know. It's rooted in Islam. So much so that you don't know. As for the phenomenon of these popular shuyukh, I'm not talking about today, right? I'm talking about the scholars that we all know of. Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Nawawi, these guys, right? Their popularity isn't consistent throughout their time. It rises and decreases depending on the context of a particular era. Why is Ibn Taymiyyah so attractive? It's not because he was a phenomenal scholar. It's not because he was a popular person. Ibn Taymiyyah is popular in our times particularly because he's relevant to our times. 100, 200 years from now, he might not be as popular. Some other scholar might be popular. Does that make sense? Right? So how many female scholars were there? Who can guess? Give me some numbers. How many female scholars do you think there were? 500. Who says 500? Give me 500. Is that a lot?
200?
200? 10 female scholars?
No.
Huh? Well, okay, prepare to be surprised. In the science of hadith, just hadith, not fiqh, right? Not these other science. In the science of hadith, there are 9,000 recorded female scholars. 9,000. Look, I'll be honest, I didn't even know that. Right? This is interesting information. When did female scholarship decrease? Around the 15th, 16th century. There's a sharp decrease in female scholarship. And perhaps, why, we don't know, but one theory is that because the role of a scholar changes, it becomes more of a job. And females, when they worked for Islam, inshallah, this is a sign that they're more sincere than men. Right? So when it becomes a job, right, they're not interested. So if female scholarship was prevalent, why are none? So I mentioned this, right? So the concept today isn't we need female scholarship in Islam, but rather we need to revive female scholarship in Islam. It's not that it was never there. It's always been there, right? But in the 15th, 16th century, there's that sharp decrease. And then post-colonialism, right, there's also that the concerns over there. It's about reviving female scholarship, not about inventing it. No. So let's stop there. There's also an issue of khuruj. That's a very popular topic nowadays, which I want to go into some detail because hopefully it'll clarify some concerns. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to, inshallah, entertain them. You know, a teacher once told me, I wish I memorized the village. He said in a particular village in Palestine, there were 40 female jurists giving fatwa. One village, 40. I don't think in all of America there are 40 muftis, like actual muftis. Any questions? Yes.
So I noticed most of the ulamas of the Hadith came from the east, way east. What is that?
Maybe at that particular time, because the western part, Andalus and Morocco, become a powerhouse. But maybe it's not until a little bit later. Because Andalus was taken probably towards the later half of, I think towards the later half, I'm not sure about the numbers. It was taken a little bit later. Whereas Iraq and these areas were taken during the time of the companions. Right? So they had about 100 years of development by then. In several decades, about 100 years of development, whereas Andalus didn't have as much. And Andalus does become an area of knowledge, where even Europeans would go and attend schools over there. Yes.
So one of the Umayyad Khalifas, or actually he went into Spain and was ruling in Spain. Was there any animosity or fighting or violence between the Abbasids and the...
As far as I'm aware, there was no fighting between the Umayyad Emirate in Andalus and the Abbasids. Right? They kind of let that go. Later, in fact, he didn't even establish a caliphate. He didn't call himself the Khalifa. Later on, he does, or whatever ruler there was. Later on, he does, yes. But other than that, as far as I'm aware, there was none. And by the way, throughout all of Islamic history, it's open borders. Even during the most volatile times and the most political turmoil, the borders are open. And you see this in scholarship, in books, right? So Ash-Shatibi, who was in the 8th century, I mean, this is a volatile time, he talks about, people who would want to go to the east for a better job. Right? So someone who wants to go to New York for a better job. This is what would happen. So there were open borders. Muslims would be traveling east and west. In other words, the political realities didn't really affect the social realities. So the whole turmoil in the White House right now doesn't really affect us. We're still living, doing what we do. If Trump gets impeached, he gets impeached, whatever, another one will come, and it's not a big deal. Right? Yes. Last question, we have
The term
2 minutes.
Sunni Islam.
Yes.
I know the term Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but the term Sunni, when did that start? It didn't start at that time.
It started with Imam Abu Hanifa, Shafi, these guys. It becomes a formal, like a crystallized, this is Islam, this is Sunni Islam with Imam Ahmed.
But they call them at that time, not Sunni Islam. They used to call them Ahl al-Hadith.
Ahl al-Hadith, yes.
But the word Sunni, when did it become?
I'm telling you, during this time.
During the era of Imam Ahmed.
With the area of Imam Ahmed. So
Because he
I
was
wouldn't say
the-
he's the one who said we are.
He's the set the tone.
In fact, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, the first documentation of that is in Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa sends a letter to someone, another scholar, and says, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah says this. So he's the one who coined the term. But it becomes an actual,
I'm still not clear on how does that translate to one word being Sunni.
Ahl Sunnah, Sunnis. صلى الله عليه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.